अस्सलाम वालेकुम एवरीवन। उम्मीद करते हैं आप तमाम अहबाब खैरियत से होंगे। आज मेरे साथ मौजूद हैं यूएस की एम्बेसडर रह चुकी हैं मैडम लेज़ली बैसेट। मैडम, थैंक यू सो मच फॉर योर टाइम, फॉर ब्लेसिंग मी विद योर टाइम। इट्स प्लेजर हैविंग यू and we had such a informative session with you and learned so much from you. Actually, you talked about democracy. I was wondering that after the fall of USSR, the world was expecting that democracy will reign the world, but it didn't happen. There is a rise of populism and democracy is retreating. How do you see this?
Well, I will offer one opinion from a very personal perspective as a retired U.S. ambassador who is no longer active in foreign policy. But in 1989, 1990, when the Berlin Wall fell, when the Soviet Union chose a different path forward, you're right, there was a lot of expectation that this would be a moment in which democracy would flourish. And I think in that first decade or so, it did. I do think that the rise of democracy in Latin America prompted us to create the Summit of the Americas, to bring in the majority democratic nations of Latin America to Miami, Florida, to talk about democracy in the region. And I think that there was hope, not just in our region, but around the world, that democracies could address and meet the needs of people in ways that the prior system hadn't been able to. Speaking from the perspective of the United States, I do think that September 11th, 2001 greatly changed that dynamic inside the United States and prompted us to look inwards, to look a little bit more defensively at the world. I think another thing that has changed dramatically in that interim time is the rise of information technology and the ability to share news, which is a tremendous gift, but also to share misinformation, which can be very distorting in democratic processes. I think the rise of inequity between the very, very rich and the very, very poor, a problem in the United States, as it is in many places, has also contributed to disappointment with democracy. And I think there are other factors that are unique to each country in the world. I think democracy is still the form of government to bet on, absolutely. But I think it requires all of us as citizens and participants in democracy to do our best, to do more, and to do not just for ourselves, but for others, to try to make sure that everyone has the same opportunity and the same access to the privileges of government and the privileges that democracies can bring in terms of education, in terms of access to work, access to homes, access to the security and safety that you hope that you can take for granted in your own country, in your own community. Those are things that aren't givens right now. And then there has been a rise in conflict and a tremendous rise in migration, and I think that the human heart needs to open more to make space for migrants and for those who are in distress for reasons that are not of their causing, but they are certainly suffering the consequences.
Madam Ambassador, if we look at the world, we have seen this during COVID-19 and after the second decade of the 21st century that the governance model of authoritarian regimes are performing better as compared to democratic models. For instance, in COVID-19, China performed better than the US. How do you see this? Why the government models of the democracies are failing?
Well, I would take issue with that categorization of how COVID played out over the long term. I think if you look at where vaccines were developed not by governments, but by scientists and entrepreneurs and businesses, primarily in democratic nations that were tested and made accessible as rapidly as possible. I do think that all nations, to varying degrees, shared information about COVID as it became known in terms of what the symptoms were, what the best treatments were. But I think you also saw all nations reacting a little selfishly, as could be expected perhaps, when an unknown threat positions itself outside everybody's front door, not just one nation's front door. And so there was not the kind of equity in vaccine distribution that you could hope for. There wasn't the equity and access to PPE and masks and all the equipment that you need to protect against COVID that you could hope for. But you saw that eventually that situation righted itself, and that in fact vaccines were distributed and materials were shared. And if you look at success or failure, I think China's no COVID policy ended up being a little bit more controversial in the long run than some of the measures taken by democratic states. I would say all of humanity had never encountered a challenge like COVID before, and that our response collectively and separately wasn't perfect is not unexpected. What I hope is that as a global community, we've learned that we do need to work together when situations like this come, because I believe they will come again.
Madam Ambassador, as you said in your talk during the lecture that democracy is an evolutionary process It is a time-consuming process, but the U.S. expects the third world countries to do more, like the Trump used to say to Pakistan that do more. How do you see this?
Well, do
You don't
more, of
think
course,
the U.S. should give time to the third world countries?
I think that sometimes when the U.S. speaks, others hear ultimatums when perhaps the U.S. doesn't mean it didn't mean to deliver it that way, but certainly you can understand why it might have been received that way. What I said in my talk, I think, is very important to remember. There is no one model of democracy, and there is no one timeline of democracy. Each nation that chooses to engage on the extraordinarily strenuous effort to build and maintain and grow a democracy will do so in its own way, not because some dictator or autocrat has decided this, but because the people have made this decision and are willing to put in the work and commitment to make it happen. Mm-hmm. I also mentioned that democracy is not a linear evolution, right? So sometimes you see progress in democratic institutions or practices, and sometimes you see regression. And in the United States, we see a little of both, and certainly we aspire to progress that we have not attained yet. And I think if you were to say, to the United States, do more, you would have legitimate reason to say that. So I think that encouragement to do better is something that we could all use at any given time. But I think the United States can be and should be humble about its own progress in tackling some of the very profound challenges to our democracy that we continue to work on and continue to aspire to improve.
Madam Ambassador, states like the UK and the US had taken a lot of time to evolve the democracies, but yet they failed to counter anti-democratic forces, for instance, populism, polarization, and the rise of Trump, Brexit. So why they fail to counter those anti-democratic forces? And if you kindly add, what should be the policies, or what are the policies that US or the UK should, adopt, being the torchbearer of democracy in promoting democracy in third world countries?
Well, again, I'm retired, so everything I'm saying here has to do from a very personal perspective. Yeah. I don't think that we are in the position of necessarily telling other countries what to do. I think that if help is asked for, we often offer help, but often by suggesting that our way is not necessarily the best way, and encouraging countries to find their own path by listening to their own people. I think that's very important. Regarding President Trump, I want to remind that President Trump was duly elected in a democratic process, and that he represented what the majority of American voters wanted in the president at that time. 4 years later, the people of the United States chose a different president, and I think that's part of what democracy is that experiment with a different form of communication, a different outlook on the future, a different perception on where the country could go. And if the experiment is not as successful as people hope, they have the opportunity through free elections to elect a different president. And so I don't look at that as a failure of democracy. I look at that as an integral part of what democracy is all about.
Okay. Madam Bassett, I'm from the region which borders Afghanistan, and you have a deep insight of the US foreign policy. So I was wondering that what was the main interest of the US in Afghanistan, and did you think the US has served that interest?
I never served in Afghanistan, and I never worked on Afghanistan policy. So I will not speak to US interests. As a citizen of the United States, I don't think that we served Afghanistan or ourselves well over time.
Okay. The last question, how do you see the future of democracy in the US?
Well, we just had a long conversation about this, in which I think that democracy is an integral part of the United States and its identity, and I am confident that the American people will muster the commitment, conviction, and persistence to see democracy succeed. But I understand the frustration of those who feel it's not moving quickly enough. I understand that growing inequity in the United States, challenges that some of which we talked about, that frustrate citizens, are certainly very important, and that we really need to ask our elected officials to deliver on their commitments and to work together when necessary so that we can move forward as a nation and not just as one political party or another political party.
Thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm honored.